Hello, my name is Robert Harrison, and I will be summarizing Chapter 10 of Murray Sidman's book, Coercion and Its Fallout. And Chapter 10 is entitled, How Do We Avoid? So in this chapter, he talks about ways in which humans engage in avoidant behaviors. Most of it's negative. He gives some examples of some positive avoidance that we carry out, and then he gives some suggestions on how to kind of fix that negative avoidant behavior. So the first part is entitled Adaptive Avoidance, and this is where he talks about some of that useful behavior that we carry out. Some of our most useful behavior is avoidance. He says, we prepare for extreme weather, we use defensive driving, antiseptic, sunscreen, things like that in order to avoid certain problems. Sidman explains how we call these people foresighted and in control, but they're actually just people who effectively avoid life's shocks. And some even prepare for the worst. And that made me think of the show Doomsday Preppers. I don't know if anybody's ever seen that, but they kind of live their life in preparation or in avoidance like that. So Sidman says here that some shocks are so seldom or so delayed as far as time that people still carry out the behaviors. And this is a theme that we'll see throughout this chapter, the immediacy of consequences. He'll talk about is more important oftentimes than whatever the behavior might be or whatever negative outcomes might be looming. So this first example, he talks about smoking and drugs and eating habits, and he basically explains that it's not a weak self-control, but it's weak environmental control, and that we need to change environmental contingencies in order to change one of those behaviors. He encourages physicians and psychologists to subscribe to that ideal as well, and to teach patients that they should change environmental contingencies as opposed to ascribing it to some personality trait. So I've actually had a good example of this recently. My physician has helped me by talking about environmental contingencies and tracking blood pressure and changing eating habits and structures and timings. And so maybe there is hope for physicians. I at least have had a really helpful one recently. So the second part of this chapter is called Staying Out of the World, and that's where he talks about dropouts who escape from society and families and schools. He talks about, obviously that's an act of avoidance, avoiding society or families or schools. And then he talks about how they usually gravitate towards fringe communities and may end up, joining cults in which they would, again, avoid responsibilities, avoid returning to the society they left, and things like that. Another time he talks about how the pain from a shock is delayed, so avoidance learning might be slow. It might take a lot of delayed shocks before we learn to avoid them. When he gives this example, he's talking about drugs, destructive relationships, being raised in a destructive manner. This was awesome. This made me think of, the mentalistic term attachment styles that I had learned about in undergrad psychology. And now this is just, putting that into more of a behavioral concept. It's actually this pattern of behavior, that has developed, and now it's an avoidant social behavior as opposed to some sort of attachment style. So I really found that interesting. So he talks about how we place blame on communities or countercultures that take in these dropouts, but in fact, the blame lies with the coerciveness that is in normal society. And if we actually want to regain some lost members, that we must admit dropout behavior is avoidant behavior, and we must look at the shocks in the environment or the society that make that dropping out behavior effective. The next part he's talking about, it's not my problem, is the subheading. And he basically talks about disengagement in a number of areas within normal society that we normal society members carry out. So he starts off by talking about community responsibilities, how we avoid attending meetings or voting, and politicians as well, and those in charge do the bare minimum. And he gives some examples of that. Um, this kind of begins another theme of the chapter where he talks about the fat cats or the people in charge of hierarchical structures, how they have they'll rarely take action against colleagues, and he used the quote, "What hurts one hurts us all." So he talks about how they kind of turn a blind eye and use avoidant behavior, and furthermore, people under them and their organizations will turn a blind eye due to their power and things like that. So he just talks about the pervasiveness of that problem, and he then makes a distinction. Oh, there's one more thing he talks about in this part. The bystander effect, basically, is another psychological kind of mentalistic thing that I learned in undergrad psychology. And he basically talks about how, controlled experiments on street violence or other issues in public settings shows that people turn a blind eye. They very much avoid helping or avoid stepping in, and again, this is evidence in controlled experiments. And I remember learning about some things like that in undergrad psychology. We called it the bystander effect. So again, it's just great to hear about it in behavioristic terms. So he goes on to make the distinction that the bigger problem is this disengagement, that this disengagement of us, of our normal society members, is a bigger problem than people who drop out of normal society and join like a subculture. And he says that that's because avoiding jury duty, turning a blind eye to problems within society, avoiding voting, that causes problems that perpetuate within society. And furthermore, he gives an example that we have jobs within society, and if we are engaging in these avoidant behaviors, then that can carry over into our job, and we can perform poorly in whatever job we have in society. So he talks about how we could easily fix some such problems, make voting easier, letting us out of work, by using electronic ballots or things like that. But he basically, excuse me, he basically again explains that those who are in power will not allow such changes because it might hurt that power. He gets into talking about whistleblowing. Then if no one will step in and blow the whistle, then what are colleagues and coworkers to do? So he uses the defense establishment as an example, and he really kind of bashes, the structure of the national defense establishment. Basically, he talks about how it's rewarded to turn a blind eye and to be ignorant to issues or problems, or not to hold accountability. And those who get promoted are those who, again, are avoidant of problems. This reminds me of like that spy movie that, where the rogue spy finds that he's working for a corrupt organization and nobody believes him, and he's looked at in a bad light until he finally proves everybody wrong and shows the corruption of the organization. But that's basically what, this part is talking about, how nobody wants to be that rogue spy who calls out their organization. And then he says that this leads to, business managers and other people in higher up positions that are maybe not necessarily qualified, or that have other agendas, and that in our greatest universities and other organizations throughout society, that this is causing a big problem. He talks about how the free marketplace is coercive, and the recipe for success in the free marketplace is in fundamental conflict with the aims of public service. So Sidman ends the chapter by reminding us that immediate survival controls conduct more than long-term consequences. And he talks about how, again, in regards to these universities and things like that, that have, people at the top that might have different agendas. He talks about how they're, again, we are placing economic consequences, which are immediate, in front of educational consequences, which are delayed. So, we'll obviously see a problem from that. I think we already are seeing a problem from that. From what I understand, America is falling behind as far as education goes, and internationally speaking. And then finally, again, these administrative structures are such that coercive pressures to increase profitability outweigh, quality of education or product or whatever it might be. So sorry I went over. That was a lot. One part of this that really hit home was the insulation of knowledge from current events. So my question to you all is, do you guys insulate yourself from knowing or paying attention to local and national world events? Or is there any other topic in your personal life that you might just kind of avoid and insulate yourself from? And then finally, do you find that this avoidant behavior is helpful or is it hurtful? Thanks.